Video, we're going to learn some new CSS techniques to both add visual interest to our HTML and start incorporating some layout into our pages. So let's get started with that. Before we look at the CSS, let's just look at the HTML structure that we have here. It's pretty familiar to some of the things I've showed you so far. First, we have a header with a little icon for a logo, an H1, a nav, then we've got a main with a bunch of lorem ipsum dummy paragraphs, and then we have an aside down here at the bottom, and that aside has three different divs, all of which have a class of card. They've got a little star icon and an H3 that says this is a feature. And then finally we have a footer with a fake kind of copyright thing down here. So let's get started in on looking at some new things that we can do with CSS. So first and foremost, what I want to do here is I want to make sure that when my screen gets large, that the text doesn't get too large, and that the container that is wrapping this entire page will be somewhat restricted, and then center itself when the screen gets large. So first, I'm going to come in here back to my HTML. I'm going to add another div in here with a class of wrapper, and then I'm going to take everything that I have below it and just paste it in there. So we'll cut and paste. So now I've got an outer div that's wrapping everything, and nothing has changed visually. But what that will allow us to do is it will allow us to restrict the overall width of this div with a class of wrapper and then center it in the middle of your browser window. So before we do anything else, I'm going to put a little snippet of CSS in here, and this is a snippet of CSS that I will provide you in the notes for this video, and I would strongly recommend you put this in every piece of CSS you ever write. It will save you a lot of headaches when it comes to layout, and it'll generally just kind of help with spacing. So first we're going to use the HTML selector, comma, and then the body selector, and we're going to say margin 0, semicolon, padding 0, semicolon. And you'll notice now that all the content is totally flush with the edge of the browser window. Next, we're going to use a new selector that you haven't seen yet called the star selector. So it is an asterisk. And basically what that's doing is it's selecting every single element on the page. We're going to use a property called box sizing, and we're going to give it the value of border box. Okay, so this should be in every piece of CSS you ever write. This line alone here is going to make it so you avoid just a whole ton of different layout headaches. So with that out of the way, let's move on to looking at some new properties. So first let's go into this H1. I'm going to select it using an element selector. I don't have a class or an ID on it. And I'm going to change the color, as we've seen before, to a little bit lighter gray. I'm going to make it a sans serif font. So we'll say font family, Helvetica, sans serif. Okay, great. So now that I have that, I'm going to apply something called a text shadow. And a text shadow is just as the name implies, it'll put a little bit of shadow behind each of the letters. So the property is text-shadow. And then the way that we set up our shadow is we have an X offset. So I'm going to say -5 pixels. We have a Y offset, so I'm going to say 5 pixels. And then we give it a color. So in this case, if you don't specify a color, it'll take the existing color, which is not what we want here. We want something, let's go for something that's just like a little bit lighter. So let's just, for the moment, we'll say pink. And now you see that text shadow there. So that feels like it's down a little, vertically offset a little bit too much. So I'm going to bump it down to 2 pixels. And same thing with the X offset. I feel like that's a little bit too far to the left. And there we go. It's a little bit more tasteful. Now, we could stop here if we wanted to, but if we wanted to blur that text shadow, because if we were to um, look at this here, you can see that there's no blur to that. So maybe we want there to be a little bit of a blur to that text shadow. So then you can provide a third value in here, which is the blur spread. So we could say 5 pixels, and then rather than being a hard-edged text shadow, this then becomes a little bit more feathery. Okay, cool. So that's text shadow. Let's look at adding a gradient to the background of our header. We haven't seen that yet. So we'll use an element selector, and we'll say background, image, and then gradients are always one of those CSS properties where I have to Google how to do it. So let's look up linear gradient CSS, and then I'm going to use MDN for where I'm going to find the syntax for that. Okay, so this is the basics of linear gradient, and we actually don't need to use background image. I'm just going to stick with background. So we use the background property, and then the value is linear dash gradient, and then really all you have to do is put 2 color stops in here. So we could say 000 FFF, and that will be going from black to white, and you can see that's what's happening. So that's the basics, but if you wanted to, you can rotate it. So we can give it a degree. So we could say like 45 DEG, comma, and then our 2 color stops, and you'll notice that it's going to rotate. So now it's starting down at the bottom left-hand corner, and the gradient is going in a 45-degree angle up to the right-hand, top right-hand corner. You can also set it up to go from left to right, or yeah, from left to right. So we could say to left, and then rather being the vertical, now it starts on the left, or it starts on the right, and it goes to the left. Similarly, you could do to right, and then this gradient will flip. And you can have all manner of different color stops in here. You could have, so let's copy this one. Oops, got to get rid of that extra property there. So now what this is saying is we want the gradient itself to have a quarter of a turn, and then we're going to have 3 color stops here. So we'll have this this color just a little bit in the middle, and then this color out on the other side. So you can do all kinds of stuff with gradients. There's virtually no limit to what you can do. You can even do stripes with gradients if you're so inclined. So that is linear gradients. We also have radial gradients. So I'll change that linear gradient to radial gradient. And then the syntax is a little bit different, so let's look that up. We'll say radial gradient. So at its base, we can just do the same thing where we have multiple color stops, and then they will start in the middle and kind of progress outward. You can change how that gradient is applied. So I'll put links to the linear gradient and radial gradient page for the MDN docs in the video description, and you can reference them there. Okay, so another new feature that we have relatively recently added to the browser are conic gradients. So if we change this to conic gradient, we'll see just kind of the default implementation of a conic gradient. You can see there's like a point here, and it starts at the blue, and it goes in a cone shape all the way around. Now you might ask, what is cool about that? Like, why would I want to use that? Let me show you this personal website of the person who basically added this to the CSS spec. And she has done things like this really cool little stripy business up here using conic gradients. So gradients don't have to just be like this blend of one color to another. They can be like any kind of repeating pattern. It just depends on how you declare the stops within your gradient. So I'm going to take this gradient off for now. So I'm going to comment this out. And then let's put a background pattern in here. So I'm going to grab an SVG pattern. So I'll come into Assets, click Pattern. This one looks good. And then paste that in here. And now we're going to have a repeating pattern behind my header. So what I just did there was I clicked Assets, selected Patterns, clicked on the pattern, and then it copies it to your clipboard. And from there you can just paste that, and it'll paste the entire line of CSS into your selector. So now that I have that background, I'm going to start moving things around in here in terms of layout. So if we look at our header and the HTML structure that we have this SVG that's inside there. That's what this icon is. We have our H1 and we have our nav. So I have three direct children of the header. So let's use that to put together a little bit of layout. So you could do a couple of different things here. First, let me give this SVG a class. So class equals icon dash logo. And then you'll notice that it's currently taking up all of the space. So let's inspect this. And there it is. But because the H1 is a block level element, that is getting its own line. So now the icon and the text are on their own lines because the H1 is a block level element, as is the nav. So what we could do, there's a couple things we could do. First, we could go to the H1 where I already have a selector, and I could say display inline, and then that will make it so it's now an inline element. You notice it is now directly in line with that icon. That's certainly a fine approach to this. But we could also start setting up an overall layout within the header using something called CSS grid. So let's get rid of display inline on the H1, and in the header we're going to set up a new property called display. The property is not new, but this value is, and we'll say grid. Now, on its own, grid doesn't do anything, but once we have that set up, then we can start declaring a grid and using that to lay out the child elements of the header on the grid that we're going to set up. So I already noted that we have three direct children of the header. So the way that I want these to lay out is I want this icon and the H1 to be directly in line with each other, and then I want the navigation below it to have the navigation links spread out horizontally, and I want to get rid of these bullets. So to do this, I'm going to say grid template columns. And now that I have this property, this is where I'm actually going to decide how big I want these columns to be. So the first column is going to be where this icon goes. So I know I want that to be pretty small. I'm going to say, let's say 50 pixels. And then the next column, I want to just be whatever space is left. So I want that first column to be 50 pixels wide, and then I want to make sure that the second column just kind of takes up everything else. So the way that you do that is with a new unit of measurement that you haven't heard of before called the FR unit. So I'm going to say 1 FR. And FR stands for free space unit. It basically means whatever space is left in the container in the grid, just give me all of that. And as long as the content can fit, then great. So now we've got a grid in here. And that's all well and good, but you can't really tell. And how would you go about developing and know how you want everything else to be laid out in here? Well, in Firefox, there is an incredibly handy grid inspector. So if we right-click on our element and we select Inspect Element, it's going to pull up our developer tools down here. Now, the developer tools are incredibly handy for just a whole host of different reasons. It can show you different elements in your HTML. It can show you what styles are applied to the HTML that you've put on the CSS. There's all kinds of stuff in here, and we'll go over this in more detail in future classes. But for now, let's look at this tab on the right-hand column that says Layout. Now, the Layout tab is really useful because it will show you anything that you have display grid declared on. So these top three are actual parts of the CodePen UI, so we're not going to look at those. But this is our header. If we look at this, we can see that this is where we have declared display grid in our CSS over here. So now if I click on this, it's going to give me an overlay which shows exactly the columns that I've declared. This first 50 pixel one, and then the second column, which is 1FR. So it's one free space unit, gives me everything that's left. So by default, the first element will go in the first column, so that's the icon. The second element will go in the second column, that's the H1. And then from there on out, each successive element will just try to fall into the next available column. Now you'll see here that this navigation is kind of spilling out of that first column. That's because it cannot be small enough to fit in the 50 pixels that we declared for that first column. So it's automatically taking up extra space here. So what we need to do is we need to tell this element to span both columns. Quick side note on the grid inspector, this green here is kind of hard to see. So you can click on the color picker next to whatever element you have selected, and you can change it to something that's a little bit more visible. So let's do like, I don't know, red. There we go. And then you have a couple other options down here. You have display line numbers, and this is very important. I'll tell you why in a minute. And then extend lines indefinitely, so you can then have the lines just kind of go out of the element that has the grid. Okay, so as I was saying, we need to tell the nav to take up both of these two columns. So the way that we do that is we first select the nav, and then we say grid, column, start, and this is where the line numbers are going to come in. So I'm going to turn my grid inspector back on, and you'll notice that we have line numbers. So we have line number 1, line number 3. So I want this nav to extend from line number 1 all the way over to line number 3. So we'll say grid column start 1, grid dash column dash end 3. And now you'll see that this is no longer kind of trying to squeeze into that first column. It basically got as small as it could, and then it wouldn't collapse anymore. Okay, cool. So now this nav, and we can see that it's there if we put a background on it, is spanning both of those columns that we had set up. So let's take this background off. But now I want to address the other things that I talked about. So now that I know that that navigation is spanning the entirety of that header, now I want to lay these links out horizontally, and I want to get rid of this bullet. So to do that, we're going to need to target this UL, the unordered list inside the nav. So we'll select this by saying, let's actually give this a class, because we might want to have another unordered list at some point. So we'll say class equals nav dash list. Again, classes can be whatever you want them to be, but I find it helpful to be somewhat descriptive. So we'll say period, because we're selecting a class, nav dash list, and we'll say list style none, and that'll get rid of the bullets. And now what we want to do is we want to turn this into a grid container as well. So we're going to say display grid, and I've got 4 items in here, so I really just want to have 4 equal sized columns so they can lay out evenly. So we'll say grid template columns 1FR 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 1FR, and that's going to make it so those list items could all fall just like that into those columns that we created. Now, if we want to inspect that and see the grid, we'll go right-click, do Inspect Element, click on the Layout tab, and now you see that this extra element that we have declared as a grid container is available in this list. So if we click on this, we'll see those 4 columns that we set up. Great. Now, it's important to note that we have a grid container in the nav here, nested inside of a grid container, which is the header. So grid can be used in really a lot of different situations. You can use it for a full page layout. You can use it to lay out little individual pieces of your UI, and you can nest grid containers inside other grid containers. But the important thing to note here is that the grid is declared on the parent element. So we declared it on the header, and we declared it on the UL. And it only affects the direct children of that grid container. So I can't place these A tags on the grid. I can't place the UL on the grid that we have for the header. I can only place the SVG, the H1, and the nav on that grid because they are the direct children of the header. So that's super important to remember. And then on the CSS side, the only thing that you really need to do is to say display grid on your parent container and then set up your columns. So in our headers case, we only have 2 columns just because I wanted a small one for that SVG, and then I wanted the H1 and everything else to take up the rest. And then for the nav list, we have 4 equal sized columns that are each reserved for the individual list items. Now, if you wanted to have more than 4 columns, this syntax could get pretty hairy. Like you don't want to write 1FR 24 times if you want a 24 column grid. So there is a shorter way to do this. You can say repeat, and then in parentheses you say how many times you want the thing to be repeated, and then the unit of measurement that you want repeated. So this is the same thing as I had just written. It's just a little bit shorter. Okay, cool. So that's the basics of grid. We're going to come back to that for overall page layout. But I mentioned before that this line length is getting pretty long. So let's go ahead and take care of that. So we've got our div with a class of wrapper. I'm going to select that by saying period wrapper. And then the easiest way to do this is to set a width of some percentage. I'm going to use 95, and then a max width where we cap that. I'll say 1080 pixels. So it's going to be, notice there's a gap here now, it's going to be 95% of whatever the width is, the window width, until it gets to 1080 pixels, and then it won't get bigger than that. So that makes it so it works really well on mobile devices, and then when you get on a desktop, it'll kind of cap the width, and it will not get too long. So this is an alternative to using the break tags that exist in HTML to do line breaks. So now that we have the width capped, let's center it. So we're going to center this by saying margin 0 auto, and that's going to center the container in the middle of the window. So we get really big, it's still in the center, small, it stays flexible, and it's still centered. So great. Now that we have that, let's deal with this section down here. So that is all contained in an aside. And what I want to do is I want to set these 3 divs with a class of card up to kind of look like cards in a row. So down here, I'm going to set this up as a grid container. So I'll say aside, display, and that's an element selector. So display grid, and we'll say grid, template, columns, and repeat. I've got 3 elements in there, so I'm going to repeat 3, 1, FR. And now those 3 cards will lie out in a row, like that. Okay, cool. That's helpful. I kind of want to center the text and the icon in there. So let's select those cards. And every single one of them, as a reminder, has a class of card. And we will say dot card, because we're selecting the class. And we'll say text align for our property. center. And then that will center the text in there, and it will also center the icon. So that's what I wanted to have happen. Let's give a little bit of a background to these so we can see it. So we'll say background light blue. Okay, so now we've kind of encountered a problem with grid. These three, I want some separation between these cards. I don't want there to be, I don't want them to be flush up against each other. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to do inspect element, and I want to just look at this grid and see what I'm working with here. So I'm going to click on my grid overlay. I'm going to change the color because it's basically the same as the element itself. And you can see that my three columns are right up against each other. Well, that's not great. We want to be able to control that. So I'm going to close my tools here. And back in the container where I've set display grid, I'm going to use a new property called gap. And gap is exactly what the name implies. It's going to give us some space between our grid elements. So I'll say 16 pixels, and now you'll see that I have that space here. These cards need a little bit of internal space, and as we have learned previously, we're going to do that with padding. So we'll say padding. I kind of want a lot at the top, so I'll say 24 pixels, 16 pixels, and then 24 pixels. Whoops, 24 pixels, 16 pixels, and then this is the equivalent of saying 24 top, 16 pixels on the right, 24 pixels on the bottom, 16 pixels on the left. So that's how the shorthand for padding works. This is basically padding top, padding right, padding bottom, padding left. Okay, cool. So that's great. Well, let's say that we wanted a more conventional, kind of old school blog looking layout for this, and we wanted this aside to occupy a sidebar and to have these three cards stack on top of each other. Well, let's take care of that. So first, I'm going to comment out the grid stuff for the aside. Now these are just going to be stacked on top of each other again. But now I want to do an overall page layout where I want to place the header, the main, the aside, and the footer all in a grid. And I can do that because I have them all in this parent element with the class of wrapper. So let's set up a grid on that element. So we've already got this selector here. So let's say display grid, and I'm going to say grid template columns, repeat for 1FR. Now you'll notice things get kind of weird. That's because by default, the first element, which is the header, is going in the first column. The second element, which is the main, is going in the second column. The third element, which is the aside, is going in the fourth column, and the fourth element, which is the footer, is going in the fourth column. That's just an auto placement. It's kind of trying to do that and be helpful. And in some cases, it is helpful, like the way that it worked when we just set up columns for the nav list. But now that we're doing our whole page layout with this, we need to explicitly start placing these child elements on the grid. So I'm going to find my header, and I'm going to place that one first. So I'll say grid column start 1, grid column end 5. So that's going to take it across the entirety of our grid. Okay, so you notice the header is now across all 4. And because of that, it has pushed the main down into that first column, but on a second row. The aside is now in the second column on that same row as the main, and the footer is in the third column on the same row as the main. So now we need to place the main. So underneath my header here, I'm going to say main grid column start 1, grid column end 4. And now that's going to get me pretty much where I want to be. I've got the main taking up 3/4 of my page, and I've got a little sidebar here. But we're not quite there, because if we were to put a background on the footer, we would see that it is only taking up that first column, pink. Okay, but we want it to go across the entirety of the thing. So we're going to do basically the exact same thing as we did for the header. So I'll just copy this, and we'll put it on the footer, and that will make the footer full width as well. There we go. That thing needs a little padding too. So we'll say 24 pixels all around. All right, cool. But again, we've got this issue here where everything is flush up against each other. And maybe that's fine with you, but maybe you want some space there. So we can come back to the div with a class of wrapper, wherever I have that selected. Down here, okay. And we'll use that gap property again. So we'll say gap 16 pixels, not 167. Now you'll notice that we have a gap between our rows here, and we have a gap between our columns. Maybe we just want it between the columns. So we could say column dash gap, and then these row gaps will go away. Or maybe we just want it between the rows, in which case we could say row dash gap. And then the column gap goes away, but we get the row gap back. I want them both, but I just wanted to show you that that option exists. Okay, great. So now we've got kind of a conventional page layout here. So what's going on with these cards here? They're stacked up right on top of each other. Well, there's a couple different ways that we could handle this. First, we could just stick some margin on the bottom of them. So we could say margin bottom 16 pixels, and that would work. That's totally fine, although there's a little bit more space down here because the last one is applying margin and there is a row gap from the grid. So we could do that, but let's just look at a quick use case for grid here. So this is going to look really weird for a second, but so we've got display grid, and currently we have grid template columns, which is pretty clear. They're in 3 columns, and we've got a gap of 16 pixels. We could change this to grid template rows, and then we'll get the 3 of them stacked evenly, and then we have like nice separation between the aside and the footer and the header. So in this case, this is kind of giving me the layout that I wanted, and it's using the power of grid rows to do that. Now I want to really specify something here, that 90% of the time you are not going to need to explicitly declare rows. You can almost always get where you need to be with layout just using columns. But I just want you to know that rows exist. They're good for more designy things where you are starting to do some content overlapping, or if you wanted to have some vertical white space, rows come in handy there. But most of the time, if you are trying to do a basic layout and you start using grid template rows, it's going to make things a lot more complicated for you. Grid will automatically create rows for you based on the content that you have, so you almost never need to declare it. Here in the wrapper, we only set up 4 columns, but we get 3 rows because that's what the content needed. Headers in 1 row, main and aside are in another row, and the footers in a third. And we can prove this by opening up our grid inspector and going to our wrapper, and we can see we've got a row here. It starts at 1 and ends at 2. We've got a row in the middle. It starts at 2 and ends at 3. And then we've got a row here. It starts at 3, ends at 4. And you'll notice now we've got these little hashed areas between our columns and rows. That's a representation of the gap. Okay, so that is an introduction to a little bit more you can do with backgrounds using patterns, and this works the same as images. Talking about gradients, talking about text shadow. The last thing I'm going to show you before we wrap this one up is box shadow. So let's say I wanted to have a little shadow coming off these cards. We would use a property called box shadow, and it works very similar to text shadow. So we're going to give an X offset, so -3 pixels, a Y offset, 4 pixels. And if we do nothing, it'll just get the text color of what's in there. which in this case is black. But we can also add a spread, so we can say 5 pixels, and then we'll get a blur spread. And then you can also you can change the color as well, so we can make this like pink or something. So pretty similar to text shadow in its implementation. You're just using the property box shadow. So today we learned about doing layouts using CSS Grid, which is an immensely powerful tool and greatly simplifies doing layouts on the web. We've learned about text shadow, box shadow, gradients, and backgrounds.